Okay, thanks very much for attending the session. I hope you've had a good few presentations this morning, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of this session. So my name is Jeremy Thake. I'm a Microsoft technical specialist based in Perth in Western Australia. I'm a SharePoint consultant and I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. So I do a lot of the SharePoint development training around Australia. I also help facilitate the Perth SharePoint user group, and I founded the SharePoint Dev Wiki, which got rated the number 5 side on PostRank at the end of the year, and kind of oscillates between the 2nd and 3rd spot on Technorati for SharePoint as well. Today we're going to cover SharePoint and application lifecycle management. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the scene with the challenges that currently exist in the SharePoint 2007 development world, what the enhancements are with SharePoint 2010, and go straight into some demos just to kind of really show you how that has improved and from the experience for developers. So just to kind of start off with, I guess, really in SharePoint 2007 development, the main hurdles were that getting developers up and running with SharePoint development, getting them be able to build a web part and be able to test it in an environment. This often required either having access to a SharePoint server which they could log into, or sitting on a virtualized environment, or actually building their own virtual machine as well, which immediately meant that developers needed to know how to install SharePoint and get it all up and running before they can actually get to the point of actually running a web part. This really made it too difficult to get into the SharePoint environment and increased the learning curve significantly just purely because of that. The tool set within Visual Studio wasn't out of the box and required additional tools to be installed on that environment, and to be honest, they weren't all that good for various things, such as being able to debug into your code and to deploy new pieces of code and new versions of code. The other thing that wasn't very easy was in terms of team development, and the fact that you may have 3 or 4 different developers who are working on a solution, which one of you may be picking up a web part, the other guy may be developing content types and list templates, and somehow you've got to pull all that stuff together. So with 2007 it was a real struggle, and on top of that, in terms of actually pulling all that together, was the case of actually deploying version releases. So we've already put version 1.0 into production, but all of a sudden there's a big change request out there that needs to be an adjustment to a content type or a new list added to the solution within a site template. All of these things required quite kind of ad hoc manual approaches to versioning and deploying version 1.1 of a solution. So what enhancements actually exist? Well, the first thing, and I'm sure you've all seen this slide at some point today, so I'm not going to walk you through all of it, but what I am going to show you is the key part here, which is the fact that the SharePoint toolset is actually available out of the box with Visual Studio. This means that every developer that's got Visual Studio in their machine will have access to be able to building SharePoint solutions. The improvements in the development environment are that now SharePoint 2010 can be deployed onto a Windows 7 or a Vista Service Pack 1 machine. That means that developers can actually install SharePoint locally on their development environment where they would usually be doing their ASP.NET development. The only gotchas here is that the operating system that you're running on has to be 64-bit, and realistically you need a machine with at least 4 GB of RAM to run Foundation, which is the free edition with Windows Server, and you really need 6 GB of RAM in total on your laptop to run SharePoint Server 2010. To do the development, you do have to have SharePoint 2010 installed locally on the machine where you have Visual Studio. So there are certain things you can do by copying the SharePoint DLLs off the server, but realistically, to do any kind of debugging and deployments, to speed up the deployment process, you do need SharePoint to be installed locally on the machine. The beauty of the SharePoint 2010 install is that there is a wizard that actually will install and configure all of the switches that you wouldn't have got if you'd have done this with 2007, such as the user profiles and the business connectivity services stuff. the wizard, if you run through the UI, will actually build all that stuff straight out for you, which makes it a lot easier for developers to get in. There are a few little tweaks that need to happen to get it to install on Windows 7 with the current Beta 2, but those are going to be ironed out for the RTM release available to developers on May 12th. So what platform enhancements have there been that developers can leverage? Well, the main one for me really is business connectivity services. This allows you to go outside of SharePoint and pull data from line of business applications, such as .NET DLLs, web services, Windows Communication Foundation web services, directly to databases and out into the Web 2 cloud via REST, etc. What this means is that once you've pulled that data into SharePoint, you can start manipulating it, leveraging the security of what's inside SharePoint and the out-of-the-box UI, which end users are already used to, and the web parts, and then thinking about pulling up multiple line of business systems and building these mashups on a dashboard for SharePoint users. Typically what's happening is that SharePoint is becoming the enterprise platform of choice, and line of business systems are using SharePoint as a presentation layer. And again, although the information is stored in SharePoint, it can be surfaced up into other applications, like for instance Microsoft Outlook, where you can have calendars pulled directly into your Outlook interface, or into the new SharePoint Workspace, which is the new version of Groove, which allows you to take things offline. As an example, you can take data from a SQL database, map that by a BCS into SharePoint, and then pull that offline with a rich client through SharePoint Workspace, manipulate that data in SharePoint Workspace, and when you come back online, it'll actually synchronize that back up with your line of business system. Now those kind of things, if you try to do that as a custom development, are extremely complicated, and obviously often just became a blocker of and put in the too hard basket. But now with SharePoint you can do those kind of things with the Visual Studio tool set, and also with SharePoint Designer 2010 as well. A key advance in the data technologies is really on the fact that there's these new APIs that can be consumed by developers, not just SharePoint developers, but also just .NET developers in general. So the REST APIs that are available on lists allow people to have strongly typed access to information that exists in SharePoint. And REST is based on the what can be consumed by ADO.NET data services. So immediately you can pull these things up into WPF and Silverlight. But there's also a client object model as well. Now the client object model is extremely powerful because it's actually been written for 3 different types of platform. It's been written for .NET, so it can be used within WinForms and WPF. But it's also been written for Silverlight as well. So you can use inside Silverlight natively this client object model, and you don't actually have to be on the server to run this. And a third approach is that JavaScript now has the ability to directly communicate with SharePoint from the client side, asynchronously and synchronously. And it's extremely powerful for manipulating data available. Obviously, there was web services that were available out of the box previously with the list data, but unfortunately, there was a lot of limitations in terms of what you can actually do there. So the REST APIs and the client object model have extended that more. The server object model from the server side perspective is still available, and there's been a lot of API changes in there and enhancements. The other nice thing now is that they've actually got on the link bandwagon, and you can use a tool called SPMedal now to run against your list and produce a strongly typed proxy class that allows you then to use link syntax to query your list. So from a developer perspective, it's very easy to and clean code to actually start querying your data on the server side within your web parts. Solution packages have improved significantly. We'll talk a bit more about kind of the purposes of those later on, but there's this new concept of sandbox solutions now, as well as farm-wide solutions. Sandbox solutions allow you to allow a site collection administrator to upload a solution package to a web app to a SharePoint web app from the web UI. So it doesn't rely on a server administrator to deploy packages on the actual server. The main reason for this is for cloud-based versions of SharePoint that are on not on dedicated hardware, the ability to deploy customizations such as web parts, such as lists and content types, without having that stopgap of having to have that run from the server administrator. Another nice thing there is that there is a monitoring that allows you to monitor the resource uptaken from various different counters and actually block sandbox solutions that are causing an issue on the server. So it doesn't, it still keeps the control on the server administrator perspective, but it just gives that freedom to customize SharePoint farms. Another monitoring aspect is a developer dashboard, which allows you to see the queries that are happening when you're running code on a page, such as when you use the object model or what it's actually doing in the SQL database, and having that visibility to developers, very much like the trace window that you get in ASP.NET. The key advantage from the versioning perspective is that now you can actually start doing things like inspecting when you activate a feature or deploy a feature that already exists in the farm. It'll see what version of the feature you've already got, and based on you declaratively putting in what changes have happened between the different versions, it'll actually step the new enhancements in for that feature. So for instance, if you added another site column to a content type, you could actually declaratively say that that happens between version 1 and version 1.1 of the code, and when you deploy that feature and upgrade it in that farm, it'll do that version upgrade for you in the sites that have that activated. There was a lot of concern around lists in SharePoint and the scalability and performance of these. That has now gone from being a concern of having kind of 10,000 items in a list to millions of items in a list. So there's a lot more feasibility for applications which would have traditionally been in SQL databases to be put into SharePoint lists. On top of this, there is now stronger relationships between lists. In 2007, there was no real ability to have any relationships and cascading deletes if you deleted items from one list that were referenced in another. And now you can actually have all that. Other enhancements now are that you can have validation out of the box on list item columns when you're entering data, and the ability that when you pick from a lookup, that you can actually show multiple columns in that lookup, not just the title column. So if you're picking a city, and you want to pick the city, but in your list you've also got a column with the state as well, you'd be able to see both of those things, which makes it easier for the end users. There's also the ability out of the box with query throttling. So if developers have wrote poor code that is not going to handle a list growing to millions of rows, that the server side will have a default throttle on it, which you can adjust, but it just means that the server's not going to be implicated if that does grow so much. The views that were rendered in SharePoint 2007 in terms of how the list looked and felt have also been significantly improved, because now you can use XSLT to manage the rendering of these. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what the team have focused on this time round in terms of the platform enhancements. And really, I couldn't cover everything there, but it was just generally the building blocks that are going to be affected for developers that are using those things. So coming on to the tools. Well, the tools have improved significantly as well, with the introduction of Visio 2010 as a tool for building out workflows by business analysts and process designers. Once these Visio diagrams have been built, mapping their workflows, they can actually then import them. Designers and power users can import these into SharePoint Designer and create their respective lists and actually instantiate the workflows that have been designed within Visio 2010. This also allows you to have that visual view of the workflows as they're moving through. So if, a good example was someone did a server diagram, a floor diagram with the Visio diagram, which they mapped in SharePoint Designer to a workflow. And what happened is that when the servers go down, the actual status of that server changes, and that is actually reflected in a visual representation on the Visio diagram. So it gives a lot more feedback from in a sense of a dashboard than it would have done previously, where it had just been a list item with a status column. The other nice thing now is that there is that continuum between the designers and power users that work in SharePoint Designer to the fully fledged professional developers that work in Visual Studio, because you can package up what they've done in SharePoint Designer and move that into Visual Studio and start stepping up what was done in there. So an example is that a business user might build a workflow in SharePoint Designer, but then they've taken it so far, but they want some extra activities done that they can't do within the next wizards. Now, in 2007, you couldn't import the SharePoint Designer workflow as it was built into Visual Studio and then just simply extend it. You had to build it all from scratch. Now that you can export these things as a WSP solution package, we can actually start from like the base of what the power users actually did. So there's a lot of improvement there from that perspective. In terms of Visual Studio, in 2007 there was no out-of-the-box source control support for Visual Studio WSS extensions, and so now with 2010 we have this out of the box, and I'm just going to walk you through a demo now just to show you what the other features are. So I'm actually running this in a virtual machine because I prefer kind of isolating it from my developer host machine. So you can see here that I have my TFS already set up with my Team Explorer here, and the scenario I'm going to go through is that as a developer we've already got one web part that's deployed into the environment inside my team collection and my team project, but I actually want to install another web part in here which basically just writes out the title of the site on the page for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. So I'm just going to go File, New Project, and you'll see now that with out of the box with Visual Studio that there is a SharePoint section here, and I'm just going to create an empty project, but you can kick these things off straight away with different items in here. So I'm going to create it underneath my source, which is my trunk branch here, and you'll see that I've automatically got to click to add to source control. This SharePoint customization wizard allows me to hook up my development to an existing SharePoint web application that's running. So I have a default SharePoint site here, and I'm just going to hook that up. And by default I'm going to get it created as a sandbox solution. So you can see now that immediately I have source control, which obviously if there's been developers in the room would seem obvious, but for SharePoint developers that's pretty exciting stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a new web part to this page. So you'll see straight away that it's added all the required fields, and it's created me my web part, and it's also created me my feature. Now the important thing to see here is that you actually now have like a visual interface of what's going on in your solution package. So you can see here that okay, there's a feature in my package, and that feature has a web part called Demo Web Part. And if I double click on that web part, if I go over to my Package Explorer, you'll actually see that I can see this all the time when I've got my project windows open. And if I double click on my web part, you can actually see it's already generated all this stuff. It's handling all of my association of all my assembly names by these new tokens, which is a lot easier to manage if you're renaming projects. And what I'm going to actually do is I'm just going to do a build. And you'll see that succeeded nice and fine. But now I want to actually debug this and have this running up. So I want to see what this is doing. So just going to do an F5, and what that'll do, if I open up my output window, is it'll actually start creating that WSP package and deploying that to the farm. And what you'll see now is that it's spun up a new window. So this is my debug window, and simply all I'm going to do is edit my page, and I should see now that when I go to add a new web part, that if I go to my custom where it automatically builds it, I have my demo web part. And if I click add there, that will actually add my web part to the page. I can save my page. Now that web part's actually saved on that page. I can't actually debug into anything here at the minute. So if I actually had the demo web part open, there's nothing to step into because I can't get in there. If I refresh that page, you'll actually see that it breaks in there straight away. So it's all hooking up very nicely out of the box for me. I'm just going to stop this now, and I'm just going to simply add some code in here. I'm going to add some code in here just to add this label to the page, and you'll see now that once that web part's actually added once, it'll remember it on that page because it references that DLL. And you'll see straight away that it's broke in, and immediately I have all my breakpoints and I can inspect all my things. If I do F5 again just to continue, that page will show up with my hello world. So that the developer experience is improved significantly. Now you'll notice that the IntelliTrace on the right hand side picked up but wasn't actually showing anything. The reason for that is that IntelliTrace does not support 64-bit. So you will not be able to use IntelliTrace, unfortunately, with these things. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how that works. Now the next thing I want to show you is that we want to be able to check this stuff in. So I come in here and I'm just going to say new web part for hello world complete, and do a check-in. And you'll actually notice it's saying it won't let me check in because policy requirements. Now if I have a look here, it says the code analysis settings for one or more of your products are not compatible. And what it's actually saying is that I don't have code analysis configured on this project. If I go back to my team projects in TFS and have a look at the source control and have a look at my check-in policies, you'll actually see here that I've got a check-in code analysis enforced, which is coming from the trunk branch of my source control, which is a custom rule set which defines my SPDisposeCheck rule. SPDisposeCheck will scan through my code to ensure that I am disposing of all the SharePoint object model, SPWeb and SPSite objects correctly. The disposing issues still exist with 2010 because underlying it is still a COM object with a .NET wrapper around it. And if you don't dispose of the objects you create, you will have memory leaks on servers where you've got high use. So you do need to ensure that you run the SPDisposeCheck tool to make sure that happens. So what I need to do is turn on code analysis. So if I go into my project, go to the code analysis tab, you should actually see that when I go into my rule sets, I can select the SPDevWiki SPDisposeCheck rule set, and I can enforce that it runs on build, which is what's required for the policy, the checking policy. Now that I've done that, if I just have my output window pinned and do a build, you'll see that every time I build now, it's running the code analysis across my solution to ensure that there isn't any errors in my code. And this will now allow me to happily go and check in this code. So, new web part created. And that will go away and check that in. Now, the other thing that I've hooked up is a build agent. And you'll see that if I run this build now, that I should see that because I checked something in, it's actually going to run a build. Now what it won't do is at the minute my build definition does not include the ability to build that project. So what I need to do is come in and I need to add that project to my definition. So I go into my source, there's my project 3, and I click OK. And now from now on, as I check in my code, it will actually stop that one because I don't need that one. It'll actually build that project as part of this continuous integration. So I'm just going to queue up that build again. So if I double click on this build, you'll see that inside here I'll start getting a bit of activity on what's going on. And you'll see that it's compiling the DLLs, and what it's actually going to do is deploy that source control. What it's actually going to do is build that DLL and then run the code analysis across that DLL to make sure that it's okay. If it's okay, it will actually create me a WSP file. So because this is a dev environment, it's not as fast as I'd like it to be, but unfortunately you just have to bear with me with the timing of this. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the automation that's happening from this environment. And you'll see that it's doing quite a bit when it's running all this. It's taking about 65 seconds to run, and you can see there that's worked. So if I go on the drop folder now and have a look, I've got a debug and a release. If I look in the release folder, and what you should see now is that out of the box, without any changes to the code, I've actually got the WSPs created there. So my admins can then take these and run off and do those things. But here's a scenario for you. If I come in here and I've got to actually do what this requirement for this thing was, which was to render out the title of the site in this web part. By doing this, because I'm creating the SP site context myself, I actually need to dispose of this object. Because if I don't, it will actually leak some memory. Now, as I build this here, what will happen is it will run that code analysis for me, and you'll actually see that it did fail, and it's told me here that I'm not disposing of SP site and SPWeb correctly. So again, you're increasing the quality of code by catching these things nice and early. So I can't F5 to see what this looks like at the minute, because the code analysis is going to block me from building the DLLs, and I'm going to get this warning. I can't check in my code. I can't check in my code because it will tell me, if I go cancel, that one or more projects does not have an up-to-date code analysis result set. So it knows I've done a build, but it hasn't passed the code analysis. Now what I can do in this instance is I could actually override that and just go, just check in. So developers can kind of bypass that. But if then I then have a look at the fact that this is running another continuous build, what will happen is on the build server that code analysis is actually going to fail. Because it's going to fail, it won't actually get to the point of actually building me a WSP file, which means the administrator can't get the WSP file to deploy it to a UAT environment or a production environment. So again, you're enforcing that quality by saying to your developers, look, nothing gets into test and production without being a released build, code analysis checked, WSP. So hopefully that gives you an idea of where TFS is going to help you. And in the build server reports, you'll actually get those error messages as well. So if I go to open here, you'll see that it didn't even build me a release folder, which is what the administrators would be looking for. And even if they went in and had a poke around the debug folder, you'll see that my SharePoint Project 3 DLL hasn't been created with WSP like the Hello Web Part World has. So again, you're really enforcing those things. So to fix this, what do? We just add using statements around our code. And you'll see now that if I do a build, this will actually work now, and I won't get any errors. And if I did an F5, that's going to actually go through and add those. And you'll see that that will now say the hello and the name of the site, which is home, on the web part when that loads up. Sorry, because it's debugging in. So you'll see now it says hello home portal on here. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how much this has improved from a SharePoint developer perspective. And I can come in now and go fix dispose leak, check that in, and what we'll see is that will start spinning up yet another build, and this time it will pass because the code analysis will complete, and it will generate me a WSP. So, SharePoint development isn't perfect. It has improved significantly from 2007. One thing I'd like to point out is that if you're working with SharePoint 2007, you're going to have to carry on using the Visual Studio 2008 tool set with the Microsoft tools. Carsten Koopman has upgraded WSP Builder so that will allow you to use Visual Studio 2010 for both SharePoint 2007 environments and SharePoint 2010 environments. So that is one option. But I must admit that the 2010 toolset is significantly more powerful than WSP Builder. So I wouldn't say that use WSP Builder for SharePoint 2010 work, but to be able to use Visual Studio 2010 with 2007, I would recommend it. SharePoint-based platform in 2010 is actually .NET 3.5, it's not .NET 4, which means it's not leveraging the new workflow engine. The reason for this was that the release of .NET 4, obviously being today, and SharePoint coming out on May the 12th, it was RTMing this month as well, it was too tight a dependency to roll them out together. So they decided early on that they were only going to support 3.5. MS Test, as you may be aware, does not support 64-bit development directly within the interface because of Visual Studio's limitations of being 32-bit. So that you have to use tools such as PEX and moles or TypeMock or XUnit or NUnit to actually do your unit testing. The web testing tools that you've been shown today in Visual Studio 2010 do have some limitations with SharePoint purely because of the fact that the way it handles the postbacks and such in SharePoint. So recording tests to record adding items to a list will not be repeatable in another environment because of the control IDs and such. The accessibility perspective for internet-facing and internal-facing sites, unfortunately it's not W3C markup compliant, it is WCAG2 compliant though. So just to cover off from a build perspective, here's a scenario where you have lots of developers and then from their machines they're building the WSPs in VSE WSS currently, and they're deploying these straight to a test and a production environment. Now typically they deploy the debug build of the DLL, and we're all guilty of this, with the PDBs, and it can cause lots of issues because developer B may not have access to the source code for the WSP that the developer A actually built, because he may not have checked it in. It might still be sitting on his directory, and there's no way of enforcing that. So how can we fix this? Well, we can have them checking in all their stuff into TFS, and we can have them triggering a build on every single check-in, which will actually create a WSP file in that drop folder. The only way things get into a test in a product environment is via an administrator, and we have a big brick wall between the developers and the administrators. The developer grabs the WSP that was built from the build server, which is from the source control, which is accessible by all the developers, and he deploys them to the tests and the production environments. This really does enforce the quality of the builds. How does this work with Visual Studio? Well, on a dev machine, they work within their Visual Studio environment, and they use F5 for deployments, and they can test it on their local SharePoint environments. When they're happy, they check this into Team Foundation server. Once that's been done, it can either be on a nightly build or on a continuous integration build, that the build server actually generates those WSPs and runs the unit tests and runs the code analysis, and then checks that WSP back into TFS, so there's a copy there, and makes it available in the drop. Potentially, rather than an administrator actually deploying that to the staging server, we can actually have an install script, possibly by using PowerShell 2's remoting capabilities to do that deployment. And then the UAT testing from the user testing happens, and the automated testing happens, and bugs are submitted back into Team Foundation, and then those fixes are kind of repeated until those bugs are eliminated. So we've configured a build now. If I go back into that environment, hopefully you should see that we've got a nice green light there for that build, and you see there's a release folder here, and you'll notice that we have a WSP package which the administrator win and release package can go away and deploy. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of what's going on here. Now there are some tricks to getting this to work in TFS, mainly because if I go to my TFS machine, sorry, skip jump, because there are some requirements here for DLLs that aren't available on a TFS machine. Now, unfortunately, TFS to do the SharePoint builds is going to have to be 64-bit, and a 64-bit install of TFS, there is actually a bug, and it doesn't deploy the code analysis. So you have to actually manually deploy that to the build server in these folders for you in here. You also have to manually deploy FXCOP, which is available now with Visual Studio 2010, into this environment. Now I had built an SPWebCast custom rule as well, which also needs to be deployed into the rules folder within TFS. And there's some DLLs that need to put in the GAC as well. I am documenting all this so that you can follow those steps, and that will be available on the SharePoint Dev Wiki. But it's just worth bearing in mind that that does not work out of the box as such. The key with the build definitions, as well as picking what projects you want to build, is that you do need to add a property to the MS Build arguments, which tells the MS Build to fire off a specific part which will build that WSP, and that is that property there that you need to add. That is the only thing you need to add to a build definition to get it to actually generate you a WSP. So in 2007 I published some MS Build scripts that did that for you, which were quite convoluted, whereas now all this is done for you. As I mentioned, there is an issue with 64-bit, and it will be in the RTM as well. There are some magic steps I will publish. Big thanks to Dwayne and Ravs and Tom from Microsoft in the product team that helped me to resolve the issue once I'd found it. So, has anyone got any questions? Okay, thanks very much for taking the time to view this webcast. Please bear in mind that you can subscribe to an iTunes or an RSS feed to be able to pick these things up more frequently. I encourage you to check back on the SharePoint Dev Wiki because I will be doing a lot more of these in the future.